We can't detach from politics, so we have a responsibility, and whether we like it or not, we are dependent on the life of the country, which makes our life possible. It's the roads, the laws, the monetary system. You can't, I'm washing my hands, it's all terrible, is a fantasy. It's magical thinking.
It feels like politics on both the left and right has become the new religion at some level. We're titling this episode Re-Enchanting the Election, but in some ways the problem is that politics has become so enchanted with divine status. How do we get the right kind of enchantment going here, rather than this kind of quasi-religious status that people now invest in their political ideologies? Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Re-Enchanting with me, Justin Brierley, and Belle Tyndall. This is the show where we aim to bring you conversations with all kinds of interesting people, looking at how we can re-enchant a secular, post-Christian world with the Christian vision of reality. And we've a rather special emergency podcast coming to you this week. This wasn't originally scheduled for season 4 of the podcast, but we thought, with a general election being called, we should do an additional interview this time, didn't we, Belle?
We absolutely did, and there is no one better to join us for this emergency episode than Professor Luke Bretherton. So Luke is an author and a theologian who currently splits his time between Duke University in the US and St Mellitus College here in London, and specialising in moral and political theology. However, from January, that title changes. He will be the Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology at the University of Oxford, as announced by the King. I'll just slip that in there, which is pretty impressive, Luke. Congratulations on that. Luke's books include the award-winning Christianity and Contemporary Politics, Resurrecting Democracy, and his latest offering, a primer in Christian ethics, Christ and the Struggle to Live Well. So in this momentous year, when more than 60 countries are holding national elections with nearly 2 billion people eligible to vote, that makes this the largest election year in history. Luke is going to help to guide us through the often choppy waters of liberal democracy and ponder with us how we can re-enchant politics, democracy, and our vote.
Yeah,
honour and delight to be with you both.
It's great to have you, and we'll cover all that somehow in the next hour.
Somehow.
And great to hear the very recently announced news about your new position coming up next year at Oxford University. But tell us, first of all, what you've been reading, because this is always our first question to any guest on this podcast, Luke. Normally we record on the top of Lambeth Palace Library. What have you been reading recently?
That's always a wonderful question and dangerous question to ask an academic, because I'm reading about 10 things. But the thing I thought actually I would talk about is this wonderful book by Kerry Day, who is a black feminist theologian and teaches at Princeton Theological Seminary, and it's called Azusa Reimagined. And it's a wonderful study of the early moments of Pentecostalism and kind of how that gives us a different kind of vision of democratic citizenship. And she's looking at how often it's misread. Pentecostalism is either seen as so heavenly focused, it's no earthly good, or it's so earthly focused, it's just a kind of capitalism-friendly form of Christianity. And she's kind of disputing both of these views and saying, actually, if you see early Pentecostalism as a form of kind of black-led, church-based, a resistance to both how Jim Crow America was kind of oppressing black folk, and also how early forms of industrial capitalism were kind of oppressing working folk. You see in early Pentecostalism the kind of the ways in which a Christian imagination opens out an alternative vision to that. So it's a very compelling, there's kind of some history, some theology, some very different ways of thinking about something we're familiar, thinking about in a different way. So yeah, it's a great book.
It's a great book. It is just, so it's like 4 down on my pile. I need to read 4 books before I get to that one. Because I think Kerry Day, if ever I met her, she'd be one of those people where I'd embarrass myself mightily. She's such a genius.
She's just a wonderful human being as well. Really, really fun person.
I bet she is.
When you're not reading sort of, high-level academic stuff of that sort of nature, Luke, what do you read for fun, let's say?
I kind of oscillate between, my holiday read is always some kind of Anthony Trollope, because it's kind of, you know what you're getting, and it's just a good. And then I've been reading a lot of lately, and I use a horrible technical term here, Georgic novels. It's novels about farming life and shepherds and the kind of seasonal. And I'm a Londoner born and bred, and so I kind of have this. I'm kind of interested in it academically, but I'm also trying to think outside of my deeply urban kind of carbon choked condition, and reading stories about shepherds and farmers and their struggles with the land is good for my soul.
Very good, very good. Well, it's great to have you on this particular episode to talk about politics, because you've obviously written about that extensively, the Christian theology of politics. You've split your time up till now between the USA and the UK. My wife is a massive fan of the Rest is Politics podcast, and of course Rory Stewart is a former guest here on Re-Enchanting. I don't know whether that's the kind of thing that you associate politics with, that kind of nitty-gritty, talking about the latest policy that, has just been announced by Rishi Sunak and all of the rest of it. I guess that's just one dimension. You've defined politics much more widely than that, though, haven't you, Luke?
Yeah, I think that's when I say politics in a church setting or into my students or that kind of stuff, that's what they instantly think of, kind of policy debates in Parliament or Congress or this kind of stuff. And part of the kind of work of, I think, political theology is to open up imagination about what politics involves. And politics is really the name for the kind of formation of a common life. We can't survive, let alone thrive as humans, without others. And so to have any kind of life, let alone a flourishing life, we've got to form a common life with others. And as soon as you do that, as soon as you're trying to negotiate some common life, you're going to come up against people who you either like, dislike, disagree with, find deeply annoying, and render you irate in all sorts of ways. And at that point, you've basically got a choice of doing one of four things. You can either kill them, and obviously a lot of human history, that's the solution to people you don't like or you find strange or weird or your enemies. You can make life so difficult that you cause them to flee, or you can create a system to coerce them, to get them to do what you want without having to listen to them, without having to kind of negotiate life with them. Or, as against those three options, you can do politics. You can negotiate some form of shared life without killing, coercing, or causing to flee. And those really are the only options. We make it very complicated about tax differential policies, but that's really what's going on. Like, are you going to form a common life with people, or are you going to kill, coerce, or cause them to flee? And obviously, a huge amount of human history in contemporary world is shaped by bad three options. I think Christians should be pretty invested for both theological reasons and for practical reasons in the option of doing politics. Now, part of politics is what we might call statecraft, which is laws, bureaucracies, parliaments, all that kind of stuff, which we tend to associate. That's what they discuss on the Rest is Politics podcast. I'm always much more interested, and I think Christians should be much more invested in politics as a kind of social practice through which we form a common life. And that's going on all around us. You're doing it, should we take the pews out of the church? Highly contested issue in most churches, and particularly Anglican churches I'm part of. That's politics. You've got a vision of a common life, you've got differences of power, and you've got some ongoing form of common life to be sustained, the church life. And then you've got this kind of existential questions. What's the shape of our worship life going to be? And are we going to do that without schism, persecution, or killing each other? Church has bad history of answering those questions in those three ways, or we can do politics. And in church, we call that synods or PCC council. We have councils, we have convocations. The church, actually, there is no church without forms of politics based around finding shared solutions to common problems that enable our life to go on. That's the Council of Nicaea. Our belief structures come out of this. And so the church is a form of politics. we can't live in our streets, in our towns, in our nations without politics. We're always immersed in politics. And so there is no life, let alone form of flourishing life without it. And I think when we over-focus on statecraft, then we lose that richer, more human, mundane but important vision of politics as a social practice, and that's when we come to think, oh, they're all, it's all bad and terrible and corrupt, and we're not realizing that we're doing that every day anyway.
So I am going to Glastonbury in a couple of weekends' time, and the politics going on in the group chat this week is madness, because there are timetables and camping and compromises and different people with different agendas wanting to do different things at different times. And I hadn't thought about that as a form of politics until right now, but that's exactly what we're all engaging in, deep politics. And so it's too early to get onto the re-enchanting question. We will circle back to it, but it just strikes me that one of the initial ways that we can re-enchant our idea of politics is to think local up, as opposed to we always think top down when it comes to politics. Would you encourage us to reverse that, Christian or not?
I think that's such an important insight, Belle. I mean, I think that's one of my biggest bits of kind of counsel is and I think this is the kind of insidious effect of podcasts like The Rest is History and all this kind of politics podcasts and the BBC and all the rest of it, is unfortunately it has the effect of leading us to imagine the world from a very abstract, removed level, the state, what takes place in Westminster or Washington, D.C., down. And then that's intensified on social media, where we get very concerned about issues that are thousands of miles away and don't understand actually what's going on around us. And it's very concrete. I see this in the States, where you've got this, hyperpolarization. And one of my kind of trying to get help pastors in American context, who are always up against the news feeds of their congregations, and they have 20 minutes, 40 minutes to preach of a Sunday, but the imaginations of their congregations is entirely shaped by whether it's MSNBC or Fox News or the social media feeds. And in all of those media inputs, they're teaching you, giving you a script, and people are earning millions of dollars off the back of this to get you to imagine the world around you at a highly abstracted, polarized way. But the reality of most people's lives are, I live in Durham, North Carolina. The guys in my cul-de-sac have very different backgrounds to me and vote very differently. I'm not that bothered about whether Republican or Democrat when they offer to pick up my kids from soccer. Like that's all. When we have this weird stuff called freezing rain that comes in, thankfully we're free of it in the UK, but it comes in, power always goes out because it's rain that's semi-frozen, hits the power lines, power goes out. And we have a gas cooker, and the others I'm an academic, I don't have to fix anything. My neighbours are very good at these kinds of things, and they fix everything. But it's the kind of our ideological commitments and the scripts that everyone's told to imagine their world entirely abstract us from the imagining our life and the reality of our life, which is, we're helping each other out. We're living as neighbours, and we're lending each other kind of mowers and this kind of stuff. And so I think a very important spiritual discipline is to understand your life from the realities of it, of where you live and work, and then read the national headlines through that prism. And the problem is that's entirely inverted. And so our lives then can be manipulated and managed by people who want to do that from the top down, rather than you can cite resistance from, well, actually, you're telling me to think about these people like this, but actually they're really nice to me and I quite like them. And what happens if I think about them that way?
I feel like it's a bit of a vicious circle, isn't it? Because there's a sort of sense in which the less we are kind of together physically, and we have all those cues that remind us that we're basically, our similarities outweigh our differences and so on, the more that we kind of start interacting with people through social media and technology, and that tends to just inevitably proliferate those differences and accentuate the polarization and so on. It feels like that kind of just feeds back on itself, and that then shapes the way that the political leaders then start to message, because, you know, if it all is being essentially dictated through those channels, then that's the way to fire up your base. You know, talking about having a common life together and so on just doesn't, at the end of the day, get people out to vote and so on. So it's how do you deal with that?
But I think it's not simply the question of you know, our commonalities outweigh our differences. I'm not sure that's right. We can have very real differences, as we know from a Christmas dinner or a Thanksgiving kind of meal. You know, the crazy uncle who drives you bonkers is also the person who passes you the Brussels sprouts and might have cooked the whole thing. And so it's learning, when we take account of where we actually live, it's learning that actually we can hold tension together. Life is a bit more complex. People have multiple loyalties. They can be deeply loyal to their family and to their friends and to their work and to their church. And these things sometimes come into conflict. And so it's learning that politics is the negotiation in the midst of multiple loyalties, ambiguities, tensions, and how do we live with that? What these monetized scripts do is they denude us of all that ambiguity, tension, and conflict, and the reality is that we can hold all of that together and still not kill, coerce, and persecute each other. And it says, no, none of that counts. And so all you're left with is highly brittle, thin scripts, which then shape how you respond to people. And that's dehumanizing. And so that's the heart, that's the existential problem at the heart of this, is this process is, it not only allows us to dehumanize others, it dehumanizes us.
I mean, again, it's probably worse, I'm guessing, in the US than it is right now in the UK on that level. So it's pretty bad in the UK. But we got these, as we said, election, you know, as we record, coming up very shortly here in the UK, the big one coming up in the USA. And what's your read right now, given all of that, all that you've just said about the way that technology and social media is tending to create this kind of polarization versus, you know, the realities of doing that common life together? What does that mean for the way these elections are going to play out this year, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the kind of ways in which that there's kind of classic script used by both left and right, which is you begin with an issue and you kind of dumb down the script so you lose all ambiguity and tension. You then make the person you're addressing feel like a victim, and then you pose yourself as the Messiah who will make things come all right. And so that then you have the solution, which is the only solution to the problem that when you go to the beginning that you've narrated as the real problem, to which you provide the answer. And again, this is a standard script that the left and right are peddling, and people are paid lots of money to come up with clever ways of getting you to believe this script. But that is and it's a highly potent political script because it does motivate people, but it does depend on forms of demonization and labeling and stigmatizing and this kind of stuff. Now, I think there is a place for a certain kind of polarization. You know, you've got to clarify what you're for and what you're against, but does that leave room for depolarization? And I think part of the problem we see in the States, I think this has been less of an issue. It was an issue during Brexit, but it's less of an issue in this election. But in the States is we have these dominant stories where we're not arguing about kind of prudential matters. Should we have more tax, more states? You know, how are you going to fund the NHS? We've got metaphysical, existential choices. It's, are you on the right side or the wrong side of history? Well, if you're on the wrong side of history, I'm not having an argument, a political, prudential argument with you. You're a metaphysical mistake. And as we see from the whole of 20th century history, we know what we do with metaphysical mistakes. They're the wrong kind of being. They shouldn't exist in the world. And so you have death camps, gulags, holocausts. And so that's the very nasty kind of logic of that position. Or you have on the right a kind of they're going to threaten the future. They are destroying the past. They want to abolish everything. Unless we stand against them, the wokesters, the whatever, the whole of life is going to collapse. And the nation itself, the moral fabric of the nation is going to be destroyed. And it's kind of heavy declensionist narratives that people have. And again, that's a metaphysical claim. And so both of those are deeply dehumanizing and refuse the possibility of compromise. Compromise isn't the necessary heartbeat of politics. It's not a beautiful word. It's treachery. And so you're threatening, compromise threatens the future of this way of being rather than compromise is the way we shape a common life. And I think that's very dangerous and extremely troubling. And I think that is, I think they're the standard political scripts we've got going on: chaos against order. Biden's now claiming he's the candidate of order. Trump is chaos. Or in this country is Starmer order and Rishi Sunak conserves the chaos. So that's a classic, who gets to claim that mantle. The other one, the kind of classic, is competence against change. So Labour is now the party of competence. I'm sure, 1980s conservatives are kind of rolling in their graves at that idea. And then kind of conservatives are the party of we're going to bring change, which again is hilarious, given them in power is 14 hours. So, but people adopt these kinds of scripts. I think in the US, though, this kind of apocalyptic, metaphysical set of stories, which we don't necessarily have here, that's a big difference. And it's very hard to come back from that. And I think that's my fear about the US election, is whoever wins, other large sections of whether it's kind of left or right won't accept the results because they can't accept that kind of being in the world is now going to be the dominant form of being. And that's a very hard, then we're not in politics. Then we're really in theology and metaphysics, and we're not doing politics anymore.
That's all so fascinating. Can I ask you a really practical question, which is, what do we do as a voter? And again, it's prevalent wherever we are, but I've kind of got an eye on America. What do you do when neither candidate has the character that you think a leader is supposed to have? Is it ever, literally, what do you do? But also, is it ever a Christian, quote unquote, or just generally a good thing to just bow out and boycott an election and say, I wash my hands of this? Is that ever in your mind a solution of any form?
No, it's a great question. I think it comes with a caveat. My answer comes with a caveat that we can't detach from politics. So we have a responsibility, and whether we like it or not, we are dependent on the life of the country, which makes our life possible. It's the roads, the laws, the monetary system. You can't, the kind of step out, to think you can, I'm washing my hands, it's all terrible, is a fantasy. It's magical thinking. But I think there are times when, as a matter of conscience, and as itself highly charged political gesture, you refuse to vote. Now, I think I would take the view that that's a fairly exceptional. There was a big debate in Pakistan recently about, because were the elections simply a kind of window dressing for a kind of dictatorship situation, and therefore, do you vote, or is it better not to vote? You can imagine debates around that coming up in recent elections in Iran amongst the kind of pro-democracy activists. So I think there are situations like that when you don't want to give credibility and legitimation to a charade of an election. I'm not sure we're ever in that situation in this country, thankfully. But I can see how people, as matters of conscience, might say I shouldn't. I'm very skeptical of that view in the context of a situation like America or Britain, where I think then there's a certain kind of fussiness and over purity that refuses to live in the reality and tensions and conflicts. And to use a horrible kind of old theological word, it's a kind of Gnostic political imagination that somehow thinks you can, to live some disembodied, pure, principled life that refuses that politics is about compromises and messy choices. Parties themselves are weird conflagrations of different kinds of ideological commitments. There isn't some there's never a pure choice in politics. As much as there's no pure choice in when I go to the supermarket. I'm horribly caught up in various compromises of, should I buy the fair trade coffee, or is that imported from over there, or do I buy the organic kind of carrots brought in from thousands of miles away, or the local carrots that have been sprayed with all sorts of things, but they've only travelled 10 miles, and so it's actually better for the amount. Life is made up of these slightly fuzzy, difficult decisions. We often mask that and hide it. And I think refusal to vote in election is a similar way of just it's a false, it's like, this is a horrible thing to say, so forgive me, but it's like Pilate washing his hands. It's a refusal to make a judgment. And at that point, you've refused a moment of responsibility, which itself, I think, is an immoral act. I'll be that bold. I'll make a claim. In this context, there are other contexts when that is the right thing to do.
Was it Churchill who said that something like democracy is the worst form of government except for all the other ones?
I think it's attributed to him.
Yes. I guess that's it. We're kind of like, we live in an imperfect world, and we've got to kind of settle on some way of having this common life. And you know, in the West, by and large, we settled on this idea of democracy. Now, do you think that, in a sense, is the Christian way of doing politics? I guess Christians have lived under many different types of governments, and, you know, some of them have been dictatorships, monarchies, whatever, through time. Have we found the best one in that sense at this point? Do our elections, I suppose, reflect the best way of doing this, a quote unquote Christian way of doing it?
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's a great question, and I think I've made a strong case, an argument that, you know, democracy is actually the political form of neighbour love. If I'm going to love my neighbour, there's a basic condition, which is I'm not going to kill them, I'm not going to coerce them, and I'm not going to cause them to flee. None of those seem to embody neighbour love. And beyond that, if I'm going to love my neighbour, I've got to have a sense that they're a human being who has an intrinsic dignity, and who, if Christ has died for them, and I'm to bear witness to that, there is always, beyond our ideological differences, a shared life that is grounded both in creation and in the love of God for them, that can be discovered. And so democracy is a way that we hold space for the possibilities of discovering the dignity and love and shared life with another without killing, coercing, and causing to flee. And so that sense of the ways in which democracy enshrines debate, dialogue, rather than killing, coercing, causing to flee, is the way we find answers. The way it enshrines that people should have a say in their living and working conditions, and importantly, from a lot of Christian theologians, Jacques Maritain, Karl Barth, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, others, drawing on the image of God, that actually pick the ability of each person to realize their dignity, not as a kind of simply notional right, but actually having some agency to contribute, to participate in a common life, depends on conditions which enable that participation, and democracy is that. And I think important distinction here is between the distinction I made earlier between democracy as a form of statecraft, which elections, civil society, bureaucracy, rule of law, the rest of it, and democracy as a kind of way of life, or democratic culture. And Jacques Maritain is a very important Catholic theologian in the early 20th century, made this distinction between a democratic culture and a democratic system. And I think Christians have always been invested in a democratic culture. It shapes what it means to be church. As I said before about synods, the congregation itself as a form of shared life has a kind of democratic form to it. We can be quite sceptical about variations on the democratic system, but I think Christians should be very invested in democratic culture. So I think democracy, there's, as you say, Christians have always been, the technical term for it, if you want the technical term, it's called accidentalist. Like, there's no required political form. You could be a Christian under any political form. The real question is, does democracy enshrine core Christian beliefs and practices, and therefore is it a better form than others? I think there's a kind of practical, prudential judgment to say it's a better form because it better enables the pursuit of core Christian commitments. Those being, and some of the kind of classic arguments theologians have made down the centuries, but particularly in the 20th century when we see democracy threatened by the rise of communism and fascism, and then a kind of highly technocratic form of liberalism, which actually does take away people's agency, is the kind of classic arguments are, if we're all made in the image of God and we need others, some form of common life to survive, let alone thrive, then to realize our intrinsic dignity, we need to be able to participate in that common life, and democracy enables that. The other one is that democracy better enables kind of legitimate authority and enables wise judgments. If you have, rule by the one or the few is often held up as better, the kind of benign dictatorship idea. But actually the reality is it's often the corruption of the one or the few leads to the corruption of the many. And if you're going to have wise decisions, you need consultation with the many. There's an ancient medieval cry, vox populi, vox Dei. The voice of the people is the voice of God. It's that kind of idea. You get a better read on what's going on if you have a broader kind of bucket of people who contribute to that. And then there's the kind of classic line from Reinhold Niebuhr and his Children of Light, Children of Darkness, where it says, man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary. And that's the idea of democracy is a good way of restraining evil, stopping corruption, recognizing we live in a fallen world. And so how do you balance power with power, as it were? And then lastly, I think there's a stronger claim you get in people like Latin American liberation theologians like Gustavo Gutierrez and others, and Martin Luther King Jr., Jürgen Moltmann, who died last week, would make this kind of argument that democracy is a way you actually witness to the kingdom of God. You witness to an order of justice and generosity that points to the kingdom of God through democratic forms of life. And that a good example of that would be someone like Desmond Tutu arguing against apartheid, where there's a kind of sham form of democracy, and what would a richer form of democracy that enabled everyone to participate and realize their fullness as a human being. That's only through a kind of democratic means. So I think there are strong arguments that point to democracy, but that we need the kind of caveat in Catholic social teaching. John Paul II, Benedict XVI, they have a kind of strong appreciation of democracy, but they're also mindful of the ways in which democracy can be turned against itself. And so what's an authentic democracy as against forms of corrupt democracy? And I think we often kind of need to pay attention to how democracy isn't majority rule. If we should be very skeptical of rule by the one and the few, kind of, monarchical structures and elite structures, we should also be skeptical of rule by the many. And democracy, authentic forms of democracy, are enabling rule for the common, not the many. And rule majoritarianism, which can take the form of certain kinds of nationalism or nativism or a certain kind of populist move to kind of demonize minorities, that's rule by the many and a kind of majoritarianism. And I think that's a corrupt form of democracy and a bad way of understanding democracy. Democracy should be, like all forms of good rule, whether in a church or a nation, about what's the common good, what's the common life in which everyone can flourish, not just the many or the few or the one.
I am just breaking into today's conversation to remind you that Re-Enchanting is brought to you by Seen and Unseen. Seen and Unseen is a magazine website with hundreds of articles by hundreds of contributors, all written to give you a Christian perspective on just about everything. That's culture, trends, current affairs. There are articles on it all, and you can find all of it at seenandunseen.com. But for now, back to today's conversation.
Yeah. And it's really easy. So I had a conversation with someone recently who has become so disillusioned with democracy, and it was a really interesting conversation. But it can be so easy to think that any failings in democracy happen out there, as opposed to thinking that they happen within ourselves. So if I think about myself now, and at the time of recording, we are literally right on the cusp of a UK election. So this is very much a live subject. When I think about where my vote will go, the downfall of democracy is happening within me, in that I'm thinking, about myself? Who will serve me? But then is it obviously the absolute ideal would be that you would go to the poll, and as you're literally putting your cross on the piece of paper, you are trying to love your neighbour through that voting process. And it's a way by which you are doing that. Is that too romantic of an idea, or is that a radical revolution that we all need to really soak in as we're thinking about this kind of voting process?
No, I think so. That just two things to say to this is, first, I think the act of voting itself is an act of neighbour love, because if you're voting, you're not looking to bomb, torture, kill, set up a militia in order to get your way, i.e., and there's this beautiful gift of democracy. It's extraordinary paradox. It's called the loyal opposition, i.e., if you lose the election, you're prepared to stand and go on the opposite benches, and you don't take to the hills with the AR-15 or AK-47 because you don't accept the results. And so the very act of voting is an act of neighbour love. But you don't need to do anything else. You've already loved your neighbour in doing that.
That's so interesting. So that in itself is quite a radical thing that we're just too used to.
We're too used to. It's the water we swim in. We don't see the miracle of the notion of agitational solidarity, that I can be utterly opposed to your view of tax differential policies, but I'm not going to kill you. That is a rare thing in human history. Let's just take a moment to realise what the miracle of that. So I think voting itself is in of itself an act of neighbour love. I think the other thing to say about this is a bad we have some very bad theologies of neighbour love, let's be honest. So one of the problems is we tend to think of neighbour love and I blame C.S. Lewis, but it's really a terrible Lutheran theologian called Anders Nygren, who Lewis kind of was influenced by. But it's this idea that real neighbour love is kind of agapic, sacrificial, other-orientated. I've got to entirely give up any self-interest for the sake of the other. I'm like, that's not neighbour love. That's one form of it. But actually, the real point of the kind of coming together of Christianity is in communion. That's the picture of God in Trinity. Christ dies not so that we all live a permanent crucifixion, so that we can all enjoy communion, feasting with each other and with God. And so this sense in which, and that's that in Gospel of John, you become friends of God. And so this picture, I think there's a lovely way. Hannah Arendt is a very important Jewish political philosopher, thinker of the 20th century, argued against totalitarianism. She has a great definition of interest. Interest is not me getting my own way. It's inter esse, that which lies between us. And so you have proper self-interest. You have proper understandings of what you need things for your kids or for your house or for your street to look good. You need decent healthcare. You need decent education. These are not selfish interests. These are interests that lie between us and which you need to vote to ensure that they are sought so that you can flourish and others with you can flourish and you can have this shared life. So voting that takes account of your self-interests understood as that which lies between us, that which enables a good shared life, is right and proper. Voting where, I'm going to completely ignore the fact that I need a decent school for my kids. You're crazy. Again, we're into some weird Gnostic world where I'm not a human fleshy being who needs to live, let alone live well. So I think we need to kind of deconstruct some poor theologies of neighbour love when it comes to voting and recognise voting, A, is an act of neighbour love in itself, and then B, is this sense in which in pursuing my material interests that I make a judgment about what it means for me to live well, I'm at the same time recognising that those interests are shared with others, and that's the party platform I'm voting for, because I make a kind of compromising judgment. There's enough of what I think there that will enable us all to flourish, and I think that other party, what they present, probably isn't going to best enable our shared flourishing. And that's as much to do with how I'm going to flourish as how others are going to flourish. And that's a proper understanding of self-interest.
It is. It's also arguably quite idealistic, because the fact is, that's not the way it looks like politics happens most of the time. It's not about this neighbour love. It's about who can basically slam the other candidate hard enough so that, and rile their base up, in order. So there's all that going on, obviously. And I just wonder whether one of the main problems in all of this, and I think you've spoken and written about this, the fact that it feels like politics on both the left and right has become the new religion at some level. And we're titling this episode Re-Enchanting the Election, but in some ways the problem is that politics has become so enchanted with divine status that that's the problem, and that's why democracy is suffering, because if you do not agree with me, you are the heretic, you are the outsider, you have to be defeated at all costs. It's, and you see that on the right with sort of the January 6th sort of riots, on the Capitol. You maybe see it on the progressive left when people who don't hold to my political ideology are denounced. And so you've got this zero-sum approach now, which means it feels almost impossible then to kind of do what you've just described. So, big question, but how do we get the right kind of enchantment going here, rather than this kind of quasi-religious status that people now invest in their political ideologies and so on?
No, it's a great question, and I think there's a very deep Christian theological understanding of politics as I use Dietrich Bonhoeff's term as a penultimate realm. It's good, we need it, but it's not ultimate. It's not the kingdom come. And whenever we overinvest in politics as salvational, as messianic, as the kingdom come, and I think Christians are very guilty of this as much as anyone else, then we think that salvation is at stake in making a voting judgment or making any kind of negotiation. And so actually there does need to be, and the language of this, of the secular as a theological category, as that which is not the eschaton, is actually a deep political theological idea, which is that we have to disenchant politics in order to enable an appropriate political judgment. Because when you're overinvested, then the world is at stake, and you can't come back from that. And so I think there is a kind of important act of disenchanting politics over and against the ways in which politics has become over-enchanted. Now, that said, I think it's also important to recognise that politics is enchanted in the kind of following kinds of ways. It's a ritual process. A hustings is, involves people giving sermons. It involves people, a kind of congregational back and forth call and response dynamic. A manifesto properly asks, or in amongst all the kind of policies about schooling and health, is asking really fundamental questions about what does it mean to be human. And I think in the Christian world, there's very key, we might say, genres of speech. So lamentation, giving voice to suffering and yearning for a better world. Now, good politicians should offer some kind of lamentation. They should bring to speech the cries of the people and what needs to change. There's also theodicy, i.e. naming and assigning meaning and purpose to suffering. You have suffered under, kind of Thatcherite policies, and we are going to kind of reunionize and renationalize the industries in order to, this kind of your life is made worse by these kinds of things, and here's an answer. So I think theodicy is about Jeremiad, which is identifying the causes of suffering and who's to blame and what's to blame, and that's a lot of politics does that. It's in that mode. I think that's an appropriate mode of political speech. It's just when that's the only mode and we lose prudential counsel and other kinds of speech, then it becomes a problem because we just have polarization. And then lastly, I think a kind of, might say, messianic envisioning. What is the vision of a better world we're seeking? And so there's questions about the meaning, purpose and character of our life together is all the time in play in politics, and that is the appropriate form of enchantment, because it's the problem when we have an overly disenchanted. If we can have a politics which is too enchanted, it becomes kind of problematically messianic. But a politics which is so technocratic and so disenchanted that, and I see this in universities, everyone is terrified of asking questions of meaning, purpose and character. And so we never ask, what is the purpose of the healthcare system? Well, it should be to enable the flourishing and health of the people. It's not, what is the purpose of education? It's not about producing kind of grinding monads for the GDP. It's actually about enabling wisdom and truth and the pursuit of truth. And how does education serve that? So an overly disenchanted politics refuses those fundamental questions of meaning, purpose and character. And I do think those are profoundly political and democratic questions, because they're asking questions about who are we, how do we relate to each other, what do we stand for? And that's always in play in elections, but often it's slightly hiding under the surface or in highly technocratic speech. And so it's a funny balance. You've got how do we have a properly enchanted and not overly disenchanted, but not overly viewing politics as salvific? Only Christ is the Messiah. Keir Starmer is not.
Speaking of viewing politics as salvific, and I hate that he's always the one I go to when I think about Christians in politics, but a God Bless America Bible, for example, I think, is there a place, and I'd just be really interested in your opinion, really, about the place of really overt, unapologetic Christianity, but hold that term as loosely as you want, right there in the high levels of politics in its most narrow sense. I'm talking politics in Westminster and the White House. Just how do we sort of on the ground level engage when we're Christians and we kind of engage with that kind of Christianity on display, maybe a wrong type of disenchantment? And I suppose the question really at the crux of it would be something like, should Christians vote for someone just because they're a Christian? I suppose is the really baseline question. But yeah, I'd just be interested in your thoughts over those kind of things.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think there's definitely a place for, and it's very important that Christians don't drink the Kool-Aid of a heavy-handed secularism as an ideology, and we should resist that at every level. There is no reason in any kind of modern political philosophy why you shouldn't give Christian reasons for your commitment to, I don't know, whether it's abortion or better schooling, or pro-life issues or whatever. So I think there is absolutely a place for Christians being unapologetically Christian at the highest level. Now, that doesn't mean you get to then use weird language like, oh, they're washed in the blood, and expect everyone to understand you. You've got to kind of not use like non-weird code speak in Christian speak that we love, particularly in the evangelical world. We love our kind of pet terms for signalling that we're like, we're in the right kind of orthodox crowd. So there's no permission or carte blanche to use weird Christian speech, because you're trying to communicate to the common rather than just to your crowd. And then I think the other thing to say is that you can travel a long way before you hit a Bible verse. And I think a lot of politicians who claim the moniker Christian just haven't done the work, frankly. They haven't thought through what is a kind of fully realized Christian view of things. And I think the contrast here would be something like the development of Christian democracy, as Angela Merkel was a Christian Democrat, and the ways in which there was quite a thickly metabolized understanding of how theology could play out in policy in Christian democratic parties across Europe, in a way in which I think when you look at some of the kind of high profile, the former head of the Liberal Democrats and others who were Christian and then got kind of vilified in public for being overly Christian, kind of the recent SNP head. I think when I hear them, I think actually they're suffering from actually a lack of really thinking through what would it mean to have a view of the image of God in all people play out in healthcare or education. And so you get this rather brittle, thin set of Christian checklists like life issues, which then stand in for a rich, theologically shaped vision of political life. And so I think there is a place for Christianity at the highest level, but those who are going to do that have to have done the work of thinking through what that means, so they're not just using like lazy reference to Bible verses or as a kind of code for I'm a Christian. And I think in terms of the voting for someone just because they're a Christian, I would just ask people to interrogate their own experience for a second. You know, most of us in churches have terrible sex scandals, abuse scandals, micromanaging totalitarian pastors who, you know, do terrible things to their congregations. We know Christians are sinners like everyone else. Just because someone is a Christian doesn't mean that is not a placeholder for their character. We're all saved sinners. And so I think actually paying attention to the kind of track record and character of someone, and the moment we vote for someone just because they're a Christian, we are not acting faithfully or hopefully or lovingly and trying to pay attention to the person. We've converted Christianity into an ideology, and so Christianity at that point becomes a form of identity politics. It's no longer we're thinking Christianly, we're just acting like every other identity, and it's just a mechanism for gaining power for people like us. And I think that's a corruption of Christianity.
Yeah. I mean, I suspect that most evangelicals who will vote for Trump in the forthcoming election aren't voting for him because he's a Christian. I think it's not that hard for most people to see through him holding up a Bible. You only have to watch him for, you know, more than a few seconds to realise he's not there because he's a Christian and so on, or claims to be a Christian. I think the reason they are voting is because a lot of them, at least when I speak to them, this may be your experience, Luke, say, I cannot vote for the other person because of their exactly those views you've just mentioned, hot button ones on abortion, sexuality, family, gender, whatever it might be. And so they are going to say, so my Christian duty is to vote for Donald Trump, even if I don't like everything about the man. You might equally, on the other hand, you know, in the UK election, you know, a Christian who is very committed to, I don't know, neighbour love might say, I couldn't possibly vote for the Conservatives because of their views on Rwanda and immigration, everything, you know. So it's a moral requirement almost on me, you know, whether you're coming from the left or the right, people see this as an absolutely sort of, so it's hard to get away from that sense of you will end up, I'm always surprised at how vociferous, especially in the US, it is that people literally see people who vote the other way as morally repugnant because it's such a kind of absolutely critical issue for them. So how do you deal with that, I suppose? I'm asking you as someone who's been in the US for a while.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not necessarily wrong for people to come to the conclusion that, I mean, I would disagree with the assessment of the kind of on the Trump side by evangelicals. But I'm sympathetic to the view that they might say, because of this cluster of commitments, I can't vote for Biden. And so I have colleagues that, you know, terrible, they're misguided, it's false consciousness. I'm like, rubbish. Like, people can make appropriate judgments, and that's a judgment they come to. The point about democracy, you've got to kind of respect that judgment. So I don't think there's necessarily a problem with that. The problem comes in, as you say, is when I view the person who makes an opposite judgment as not simply coming to a different judgment in good conscience, but as repugnant, as disgusting, as the wrong kind of human being who's just, you know, beyond the pale. And so I'm demonizing and kind of stigmatizing them in that process. And I think that's where we see, and there's interesting polling on this, the ways in which those who are regular churchgoers, I think at that crucial moment of I come to this conscience but I view the other person still as a human who can come to a different... I think whether you're a regular churchgoer or not makes all the difference at that juncture. And I think what we see increasingly is those who take up Christianity as an identity politics because of a kind of, I'm not a fan of the term, but Christian nationalism, like that we've got to defend this way of life. And Christianity simply then is functioning ideologically rather than as a body of belief and practice which disciplines me and shapes me as a human. I've rather at that point turned Christianity into a political tool to defend a way of life as I see it. And I think that's a question then of how do churches kind of preach and teach and form into that. And that's very hard. It's just very, very, very hard. And we go back to the problem we talked about earlier of like how when you have 20 to 40 minutes on a Sunday, do you counter a 24/7 news feed that's shaping people's imaginations? And I think that is a very real crisis for the church, is the ways in which the church is, of whatever stripe, but particularly in the evangelical world, are kind of increasingly finding their language, terms and conditions and ways in which they shape and try to preach about the gospel completely turned in on itself and becoming an ideological tool of a political program which has nothing to do with Christianity. And a good historical analogy here is there was a movement in France developed in the late 19th century through the 1920s and 30s called Action Française. And Action Française said their strapline was in French, "Will defend family, faith and flag." And there were hundreds of thousands of Catholics joined Action Française, and they had real reason to fear. There were the communists killing priests up in Russia. There was a highly militant, secularizing liberalism that wanted to get rid of the church in public, and so they had legitimate causes to fear. But Action Française, the leaders of Action Française, I think, like Trump and others, they weren't Christians, and they at least had the integrity to say, we're not Christians, but we view Christianity as the anchor of French civilization. It was a Make France Great Again project. And they turned Christianity into, they weren't interested in proclaiming Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. What they were interested in was securing Frenchness, as much as Trump is interested in securing Americanness and some particular idea of that highly exclusionary version of it. And Christianity at that point becomes an anchor for a particular, I think, quite unjust vision of culture and its civilization. And at that point, it's not being Christianity, it's a cultural civilizational project. And I think that's where Christians have to be very alert, and church leaders have to be much clearer to not be seduced by the legitimate fears they have. And there are real things to be wary of and be scared of. But at that point, being seduced by those who offer to defend you in the name of something which is utterly corrupting of what you claim to believe. And I think I think we need to be much more attentive to the dynamics of seduction in politics. And that's a very insidious, and it goes to this question of, how does evil, this kind of anticipate later question, but how does evil come into politics? But I think it comes in often, the devil comes dressed as an angel of light. The very thing you think you're turning to defend that which you hold precious and love and want to hold up becomes the very thing which corrupts and destroys you.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, exactly when you were saying that, the Bible passage that came into my mind was Jesus' temptation in the wilderness and the Satan offering him all the kingdoms of the world if he'll just bow down. And it's that kind of, it is that compromise, isn't it, ultimately, where you surrender faith in God for faith in politics or power, basically, that is kind of, and it's interesting that that's bookended, at the moment of Jesus' death, he's facing power, obviously, in the form of Pilate. And again, he refuses to allow that way of doing things to kind of be the way in which, his kingdom is going to be.
But it's there, I was thinking about this the other day, it's there, interestingly in Genesis at the moment of the fall, because we often interpret that as different ways of interpreting it, but there's a sense in which the pursuit of something good, knowledge, desire for life, growing and becoming more, these are good things. That's part of the creation mandate. You're supposed to grow, go forth and multiply. But at that very moment, there's this unbelievable realism in the Bible. You're seduced into pursuing that thing in a way which becomes a grasping, which destroys you and destroys the world around you. And it's so hard. I think it's just really hard. We're all prone to that. It's very hard. These are the kind of, but it's particularly pressing on us in these political pathologies, which are just very seductive, but deeply, deeply, deeply corrupting.
Christian history is just littered, I suppose, with things that started out with all the right intentions, but became idolatrous. That became, that suddenly, something that was started in the right ways, it got corrupted, and that's just the nature of humans, isn't it?
You see it in some ways. You see it every kind of phase of Scripture is another moment when the very things were set up to keep the people holy become the things that have to be repented of. There's that haunting line, I think, is in Isaiah, where sweet is made bitter and bitter is made sweet, and it's like, yes, but that, and I think you see that. It always kind of comes back to me in the context of America, of seeing these things which should be celebrated. And a good example of this is the distinction between patriotism and nationalism. Appropriate love of country, a desire to see its flourishing, a sense of honour and loyalty to that which makes your life possible, morphs into a highly destructive desire to exclude others and just pursue it for a tiny group of you who and kind of sacralize a history which was kind of ambiguous and quite problematic, and becomes gussied up to become, hallowed ground. And we see then the corruption of the very thing you love through this nationalistic excess, and it's that kind of dynamic. How do we teach and preach to enable Christians to resist that kind of temptation? And I think we're not doing a good job of that.
Yeah. So with all of this in mind, and this conversation has been so rich, and in many ways I have needed this personally more than professionally. I'm just asking you all my genuine questions. It's been like, yeah. But I just, with all of this in mind, just bringing it right down, both to the elections that are coming up very imminently in the UK, a little bit later in the year in America, but also just in general, like when you're engaging with the debates that are happening between leaders, and neither of which is character is fully convincing, or, when you're reading the manifestos that are flying through your door, and ultimately when you're going to vote, when you're going to do that, what are the things, Luke, that you are trying to keep in the forefront of your mind, and that you would encourage us to try and do the same?
Gosh, that's this is a very troubling question, because I've been pondering this. It's tricky, and I'm going to vote in two elections. I'm voting the US election and in this one.
Oh,
so
nice.
I'm presented with two very kind of
double
similar
whammy,
but different, kind of sources of consternation on this front. But I think this sense of the kind of good enoughness of a choice, is this good enough? That there is no perfect, I'm not looking for a perfect solution. And I think the other, which goes back to this question of character and track record, when I look at the kind of track record and character of these people, is there a sufficient sense in which they're going to make moderately wise judgments about life scope? Because the policies in some senses are irrelevant. You're always going to have to respond to, look at the pandemic, look at, who knows if there's going to be a housing crash in 6 months' time, or there's a huge issue with debt. World events, Israel, Palestine, Russia invasion of Ukraine. You're really electing someone. There's a kind of sense in which the manifesto is an orientation to the world. So what is this an orientation which I like the look of? And then when I look at these people, do I have a sense in which, how are they going to respond when, excuse my language, the shit hits the fan? Like, is there, and there's sufficient people around them that there's some sense of energy and life, and they're going to kind of have some capacity to cope with all the crises, and politics is lurching from one crisis to another in some ways. And I think those are the kind of judgments. And when I think that's less pronounced and pointed in the UK context, but I do think whatever one's ideological commitments, you just have a very tired party who needs a rest. God bless them, you know. But it's just that's slightly my view
pastoral.
on it. Was. I went into pastoral mode. I was like, they need a cup of tea and a rest, and just sit by the fire for a bit and like take some time out.
That was the nicest criticism of the Tories I've ever heard in my life.
That's generally my view on that. I think it's a different judgment in the States, which is I think the no one on Trump's side is hiding what they want to do, which is dismantle the state and do all sorts of, and they're being very plain. And so you just got to say, well, am I for that or am I against that? So I think the question of the kind of Christianness, which plays very strongly in America, I think that's a very hard. Biden is in many ways the most Catholic and most Christian president America's had since kind of Roosevelt. I mean, since Second World War. I mean, but you would never know that. Like so he's regularly in communion, and Trump clearly isn't, and a lot of people around Trump have terrible criminal records and all these. So you do have to take that seriously, whatever one thinks of the issues, and how do you think they'll respond to the kind of all that the world throws at them? And I don't think they responded that well last time. I think they'll respond pretty badly this time. That doesn't mean to say I agree with everything it's about. The Democrats are terrible technocrats and have all sorts of terrible policies I disagree with, but I think that question of orientation and kind of character do matter, and that's kind of I think there's a good prudential judgments that one can make realistically, and then there's a slightly like, we'll see, you just don't know, and that's also part of politics, which is which is crucial to always remember. Machiavelli has this great definition of politics as action in time, and the idea that you can predict the future, that the consequences of your actions. These are fantasies of control. You have to make an appropriate, good enough judgment here and now, and then you kind of trust. And that's why it is kind of an act of faith in some ways, in that lesser use of the word faith. And we part of our problem in the modern world, and our phones then we think we control the outcomes, and we think judgments are like some algorithmic predictive force. It's not. You've utterly misunderstood politics if you think AI will do it for you. It's always a deeply fleshly, human, slightly odd, kind of difficult, negotiated judgment in time that you might make a different judgment in 5 years' time or even 3 days' time. That's okay. It's action in time.
Yeah. Well, that's why we shouldn't turn politics into our God, that's for sure, because it's a very, very human endeavour, isn't it? It's been so good to talk with you, Luke, ahead of the elections. Now, we have listeners and viewers in the UK and the USA. In fact, most of the listeners who make up the listenership of this podcast are in those two places. So whether you're voting on the 4th of July here in the UK or the 5th of November in the USA, both of which are oddly kind of interesting political dates, aren't they? 4th of July, independence, and 5th of November, the gunpowder.
Not the same resonance
plot.
In America. I keep trying to persuade them of its merits, but they look at me when I tell them the origin story. I said, we celebrate burning Catholics at the at the stake. It's great fun. And I'm like, they look at me, I'm barely civilized.
Yeah, well, there's a lot lost in translation, I think, between both of our continents. Anyway, wherever you're voting, or indeed in many of the other elections taking place all over the world this year, I hope that today's conversation has been helpful at some level in just stepping back a bit from the what we are constantly bombarded with on our TV screen and social media, to think more deeply about what it is to be engaged in politics, to be engaged in election, to walk into the booth on that day. And I guess the challenge for me has been, Luke, that our responsibility does not begin and end when we tick the box, but it's actually about, well, what happens next? Am I trying to achieve this common life with the people in my street, in my town? Are we going to kind of try to transcend these terrible political divides that seem to be so prevalent now? So thank you so much for being such a wise, helpful voice in helping us to do that today.
No, I think that's, and thank you, real honour to be. And I think that your final point there, that's the real choice, is how do there is no common life without trust. And so whatever, if one votes, doesn't vote, however one votes on, in an election, the most important thing is, how do I act with those around me to cultivate trust? And as we see, whether it's the collapse of the banks in 2007 or collapse of kind of trust in democracy, when you lose trust, a common life becomes impossible. And so I think that's our bigger crisis, is a crisis of trust. And how do we cultivate and renew trust in each other, and so that we can hold tension, hold disagreement without killing, coercing and causing each other to flee. And we see around the world, when societies lose trust with each other, you have civil war, you have civil strife. It becomes hell on earth very quickly for lots of people, particularly the vulnerable and the marginalized. And so I think it sounds so kind of fragile and so impossible that something as important as intangible as trust can be the basis of the whole of life, and yet that really is the truth of it. And I think as Christians and churches, that's really the biggest contribution we can make, is rebuilding trust. And it goes on, I think, in beautiful ways. Mothers and toddlers groups, soup kitchens, just being nice, and kind of around these seemingly very kind of silly things that most of society dismisses as important, turn out to be the most important thing. And I think that's if I've any kind of word for this season, is whatever the maelstrom, drama and melodrama of our political moment, just the simple gestures of kindness and trust building is actually the most powerful act we can do today.
Yeah, that's great. Oh, Luke, thank you so much once again. I knew this was going to be good. Knew it. But yes, it's been incredibly helpful. So thank you ever so much for your time and your wisdom.
Pleasure. Honor.
Yeah, thank you so much, Luke. And if you're watching or listening and you'd like more from Luke, do check out the links with today's show so you can find out more about him. And we'll look forward to seeing more about your fancy new job in coming months as well, Luke.
Yes, we will.
But from Belle and me, it's time to say goodbye. Thank you. As we said, when you turn out to vote, do say a prayer before you enter the election booth, and think about what happens next as well. If you want to get more from Re-Enchanting, do make sure to check us out online, via our podcast, via our YouTube channel. And of course, there are ways to support us as well, aren't there, Belle?
There absolutely are. You can subscribe and get all the behind-the-scenes content straight to your inbox. We can do all the work. And you can give as well. Again, seenandunseen.com/give if you want to make future seasons of Re-Enchanting happen.
Thanks for being with us, and we'll see you next time.